Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Cat, and in this video we are going to talk on function. What is function in Golang, right? So today we are going to dive into the world of function in Golang. Now if you are brand new to the programming, right, don't worry, I will be explaining everything in a way that connects to real things in your real life, right, which you already know. So what is function? Imagine a function like a kitchen appliance, let's say, and then say blender, or you can say mixer, and then you give it some ingredient, it will do something, and then it will give you back smoothie, all right, as output. So in programming, a function is a reusable block of code that takes input, also known as parameter, and then it will process something, and then optionally it will return a result, right? So let's write some basic function in Golang so we can see how function works in Golang and what exactly the function is, what is the benefit of creating function, what is the benefit of using function. All right, so very simple. I'm just going to create a function. And how can we create a function in Golang? Golang says, okay, you need to use func keyword, func, right? And then using func, you can create any function you want, and the function should always be a specific functionality. So I'll say here, okay, create one function to add. I'll say add number, and then we know by the concept of function, it will accept some input. All right. So I will say, okay, let's accept one input over here, and this time a value a and one more value as a b, and then this will return, this will give some output. This function will actually add these two number and give the output. And for output, you just need to define the data type over there. Okay, the output should be integer, and if you are going to return different data type, of course this will give you error, because you are expecting this function to return an integer type data, but then you are returning something else, right? So that is not allowed in Golang. And here what I'm going to say is, okay, you just do a plus b, that means it will just add those numbers and return back, right? This is how you are going to define a function. This is how the function works in Golang. Simple. So here what I'm going to say is, okay, all right, this function is run, this function is actually expecting some input, and based on the input it will perform its functionality and then return back the result, right? So I'll say, okay, result, and then I will just use this add number, since this add number will give some output, and that output we are keeping here in this result variable. So I will say this time, let's say 2, and then pass 3. That means we are passing 2 argument over here, and then this function will add up these 2 argument a plus b and then return the values, right? So now we have the result. So let me just print the result if that works fine. So I will say result, right? Just save this and run this program. Let's see if that works. All right, we can see here we got 5 over there, because this function will perform some actions or operations on this specific input based on the specific input, and then it will return the value. And this is called actually a returning function, and the returning is completely optional. If you want to return this, you can return. If you don't want, if the function should not return anything, then we should not return anything, right? We'll see the type of function next in this video. So now let's compare this with real scenario. So I will say, okay, just create one more function. This time I'll say make coffee, right? And then for that, for making coffee, you need something, right? You need coffee powder, and then you need water or milk, whatever you need. So I'll say powder, and then how much powder we are going to take. So it will just decide the capacity. We'll just provide the powder capacity, not capacity, but the quantity. And then I'll say, okay, let's pass water, and then 100 ml water or something, whichever you want. And then finally it will return a coffee. And how can we do that? We know that this is a function, and this function should perform certain functionality. So based on the powder and water, actually this should blend coffee, right? So I can say, okay, I can say fmt dot printf. This time I'm going to use printf because I just want to format this string that has to be printed on the console. So I'll say okay, blending, let's say blending, whatever you want you can say here. So I'll say blending powder and water, right? Powder, how much quantity we are providing. So in this case I will say powder equals to, let's say, percentage d, because we know that integer is going to be replaced, this percentage d is going to be replaced by integer value. And then water, I'm going to say okay, water is going to be again integer value, and then I will pass the exact value over there. So I'll say powder and then water, right? So now it's blending, and then let's say after 5 seconds or after 3 seconds coffee will be ready. Okay, so here I'll say okay, just wait for 3 seconds. And how can we wait? We can say okay, use this time package, and then on time package we have sleep function. So use this function and then pass the duration. So I'll say time dot second and multiplied by, let's say, 5 seconds, right? We need to wait for 5 seconds to blend this powder and water, and then we'll get a coffee. So now I'm going to, since this function is returning a string value, so you need to return a string value from here. So I'll say return hot coffee is ready, or you just return the hot coffee, right? That is what the function over here, make coffee. So it will return the hot coffee finally, and I will just save this and call this. How can we call this function? We know that this is the way we need to call. Just we need to type the function name exactly and then the small bracket. And if it wants some input, we can provide the input, or if it doesn't want input, that's completely optional. We don't need to provide any input over there. So here we are expecting to pass powder and water. So I'll say okay, pass 80 ml of powder and then pass 100 ml of water, right? Now let's see, this function will return a result. We have those results over there defined as a variable, and then we are just printing the variable. So let me just save this and run this program once more, and we'll see how it works. We can see here blending powder 80 and water is 100 ml, of course, and then after 5 seconds the hot coffee is ready. So this is how a function works. All right, now there's why to use this function actually. So what if, let's say, in morning time we need coffee, and then afternoon also I want to drink coffee, and then night also I want to drink coffee, right? So every time we cannot write this specific code at each of the time, right? Morning, night, and then of course afternoon. Every time we cannot write this, since what if, let's say, we have 100 lines of 100 lines of code over here, or we are going to perform lot of operations inside this function, and we can have more than 10 or 100 lines of code, of course. So every time we have to write those 100 lines, right? And if that has to be happened for, let's say, 100 times, then you can multiply that lines by 100, right? So immediately your code will become messy, and that is not the good way to maintain the code. So instead what we can do is we can wrap those specific logic inside a function, and that's the exact use of function. So we can avoid repetition of the task, right? Instead of writing the same code multiple times, you write a function once and reuse it, right? So now if we want to make coffee 100 times in a day, I will just call this function and then pass the required data over there, pass the required input over there, I will get the coffee. So we don't have to write these 3 lines of code 100 times. That means we saved 300 lines of code, correct? Not 300, but at least 200 we saved, right? So it is, and also it is easy to read, and it is easy to maintain. It is easy to debug as well in case something is breaking over here. All right. So now next we are going to understand the types of function in Go, and very first is, let me just define it over here. There's no input and no output. That means let me just define one function. Let's say this time it's greet. All right. So there won't be any input and there won't be any output as well. That means we are not going to return anything from this function though, so we should not say anything returning, any returning type over here, right? As in the case of making coffee, we can see we are returning a string over there, right? So we need to return this compulsory, and if I will just comment this, you can see this function is giving error, missing return, right? So we should not do that. If it is expecting returning value, we need to return the value. So here the very first type is going to be, I'm going to comment this, no input, and this function will give no output. All right, it will just execute and do its works. Fine. So now in this case, I'm going to say, okay, let's print something, fmt.println, and this time I'm going to greet. So I'll say hello developer, right? Here we don't need to greet a developer, we don't need anything over here. We'll just simply say hello developer, right? And also there should not be any output, it will just print to the console. So we can say this is clearly legal. So let me just comment this over here, and then I will call this greet. And since this time we don't need to pass any input, neither will get an output from this function, so we can just leave it as it is. Since there won't be any value, it is just a function with no returning type. So let's execute this function and see if it works or not. So I will clear this console and run this program once more. You can see hello developer, right? And if you want to make it relate with the real life example, you can, of course this greet is one of the real life example, but I will give you one more. So let's say you are standing on a door and then you need to press the bell switch, right? Do we need to provide some input to the bell? No, we don't need. We'll just press the bell switch and then it will ring. That's it, right? So for that I'm going to say, let's say ring bell. I'll say ring bell, and then there's no input, there won't be any input outside of the switch, right? So I'll just say simply it will do its work, and this time I will say bell rings. Let me save it and call it here. So ring bell, and then just run this program and see if that works. So we can see here bell rings, right? There's no input and there's no output. All right. So this is exact what the function of no input and no output. Now next we have with input but no output. So let me just comment it over here. I will say function with input but not output. We'll be just providing the input, but there won't be any output. So let's say you want to greet a specific person with the name. That means you want the name of the person, but you won't be returning anything to the person, right? So in that case I will say, okay, let's create one function, and this time I'm going to say greet, and I'll say person, but this time I need name of the person. So I'll say, okay, provide me name, and then this won't be returning, there won't be any output, right? So when you will call this function, you won't be getting any returning data back. All right. So let me just copy it from here, and then I'll paste it here. I will simply say, okay, I'll say hello, and then this is going to be the name. So let me just save it and call this function here. I'll comment this over here and then call this input function greet person, right? And this time it is expecting a name. So I'll say Zad, my name. So let me just save it and run this function once more and see what's the expected output over there. So we can see here it's saying hello Zad, but out of this function there's nothing coming over there. So we cannot store any variable over there because there's no data getting returned from this function, right? So this is second type of function which we have with input but no output. All right, it's just sending someone a message and you just give their name, but you don't expect a response. All right. So whatever they want to do with your name, they can do. Correct? Now next we are going to see one more type of function which is with input and output. And of course we saw that here in case of making coffee, right? But let's create one more function. Let's say I want to create a function that will actually multiply the value. So I'll say a is going to be of type integer, and then b is also going to be type integer, but this time after multiplying this both value I need some result back. So I'll say integer will be returning, and then here I will say return a multiplied by b. That means we are expecting some value from this function, and the value which is going to be returned we need to mention here as an integer, right? If you want a string, you need to mention a string like this, so that golang will understand, okay, this function is expecting some response to be returned in the format of in the format of a string, data type string, right? So when I will use this function, how can we do that? So we can simply say, okay, let me just comment this function here, and I will call multiply now. So now multiply will be returning some data integer, you can see here, right? So if I'll pass 2 multiplied by 5, then I'm getting some data, so I can store that data over here in result variable, right? And then let me just print this variable. So I'll say println and then result. Now save this and run this code if it works. We can see here we are getting output as 10, and that is getting consoled or logged from here. So that is another one type of function which we saw. And the parameter which we are passing over here is also called as argument. All right. So now next thing we are going to see one more type of function which will be accepting input, and then it will be returning multiple output. So in this case I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to create, okay, I will say multiple input, or we can say with input. Of course this input contains one input or multiple input, and then it's mandatory to return multiple output. So I'll say multiple output, right? So here I'll say func, and then I'll say divide, right? And then I will say a and b, this both are going to be type integer, and then we are expecting some data back from this. So I'll say integer and integer, and why I'm returning both in integer, let's say there will be quotient and then remainder as well. If we are going to divide a by b, there can be remainder as well, right? So let me just say, okay, what will be the quotient? So quotient will be a divided by b, right? And then remainder will be it will be a modulus b, right? That's a plain maths, right? And then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to return you quotient and then the remainder. So I'll say return this, because we know that this function will be returning this time 2 values, and if we are going to return 2 values, we need to enclose that inside a bracket, and then we need to separate the returning type with this comma, right? That is what the syntax of this returning type, multiple return type. And this time I'm going to say first parameter which we are going to return, or first data which we are going to return is quotient, and then other data which we are going to return is remainder, right? Let's save this, and I'm going to call this function here so that we can see the result. So I will say, okay, result, and then this time I'm going to call divide function, and then we need to pass a value. So I will say 15 and then 2, but then you can see here we have some issue over there. Why is that so? This time this function is actually returning 2 values. You can see here assignment mismatch, one variable but divide returns 2 values. We have defined one variable over here, but we know that this divide is returning 2 value here, right? Where we have defined this divide, correct? So in that case we need to define 2 variables so that it can store all those variables which is getting returned from the divide. And if it is returning n number of variables, we need to define n number of variable here if we want. And let's say if we don't want that variable, so Golang says, okay, that's completely optional, you can omit that as well. So we'll see that how can we omit that, but before that I'm going to store this here as well. So this time I'll say quotient and then remainder. Now this is completely legal because this variable, this function is returning two value of type integer and integer, and we have stored both integer in q and r, right? And finally here I'm going to say okay, just do print, and I will pass this q and r. Let's see how it works. So I'll just rerun this program and see if the output is as per expectation. So we can see here 7 and 1. 7 is of course the quotient, and then remainder is 1, because if we divide 15 by 2, of course we will be getting 7, and then the remainder will be 1, right? So this is the way we can use a function to return multiple data type. All right. So now, sometimes before we talk about if we want to skip a specific variable, how can we do that? So Golang says, of course Golang says you can do that. Then how? So if you don't want to define a variable, if you need only quotient, you don't need remainder. So if you don't need a variable, in place of that variable you can just say underscore. That means you don't need to define a variable for that. This underscore will actually skip that variable. All right. So now I'll just need quotient, and then let me just save it and see if that works. But this time remainder won't be there, even though it is getting returned from divide, but we are not using that remainder over here. So why we need that, right? So we are just omitting this variable, and then everything is working fine. You can see we have 7 over there, correct? So this is actually the concept of the function, and we have lot of function over there, right? Different types of function over there, and we learned all those different tastes of the function. Now we are going to learn one more topic, which is actually a very flexible functional topic in Golang, and that is actually being used, that if you know that, you can use that concept in your application development, or if you are working in a company, there also this concept you will be using. And this is actually the cool concept, very flexible and very advanced concept, you can say. So what is that actually? So in Golang we have function as first class function. What does that mean? It may sound new to you, right? So if you're a beginner, so don't worry about that. I will cover each and every concept of this first class functions. So in Go, function are treated as a first class function. That means you can assign them to a variable. That means you can pass them as an argument, and that means you can return them from another function. That is exactly called first class function in Golang, and we will see all those one by one. So let me just write it here. I will say first one is going to be a function, assign them to a variable, all right? So we can assign a function to a variable. Of course we did that before here, you can see here, right? Same thing we are doing here. We are assigning this function to a variable, but we'll deep dive into that. And then second, we are going to say okay, we can pass them as argument as well. So if we want to pass a function to the different function or another function, we can pass the function there as well. So we can say pass them as an argument in other function, and we'll see all that in action. So third, we said return from a function, we can return another function. So we can say return them from other function, right? And this will actually give you the more flexibility of writing code, and this will actually solve a lot of problems in your application, and we'll see that in action. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say okay, create one function over here, func. I'll say func, and then I will say hello, right? And then I will say okay, say hello is there, and then what I'll do here is I'll just do println or something. So let's just do println, and not println, this say hello will actually return a string, let's say, and this is the string returning type function, right? We can have a single returning type or multiple returning type, which we saw above in this video. So I'm just going to say okay, that's fine. So I'm just going to return hello, all right? And let's accept one name over here, so we can say hello name, right? So I'm going to say hello, and then I'm just going to concatenate this with name. so that finally it will be hello and the name which we are going to pass here, right? So we have this function. Now, as per the concept of first class function, it says assign them to a variable, means function can be assigned to a variable, and let's see that if we can do that. So I will comment this over here, and this time I will say okay, create one variable. So I'll say greeting, and then I'll say hello. Can we able to do that? Yes, we are able to do that. So instead of calling this function, we know that how can we call a function. So for calling a function, we need to use this bracket, right? So that we can say, okay, we are calling this function. That means that function is to be executed right away when you are calling that. All right. But in this case, we are not going to call this function. We are just going to assign this function to a variable. Since we know the concept of high order function, not high order, but you can say first class function in Golang, right? So now if this is a function, now this we have assigned this say hello to a function, then this greeting will be a type of function. You can see here, right? This greeting is a type of function and it will return a string. So let me just call this function now. I will say println. If this is a function, this greeting is a function, of course we can call it, right? So we'll say greeting, and then if this is a function, we should be able to pass the value, right? And then I will say, let's say developer this time, and I will just save this. Let's run this program once more and we'll see if that works. We can see here we are getting the output which is expected, right? So this way we can say the function is first class function, and we should be able to store this function as a variable, correct? So that is what the concept of assigning them to a variable. Next we are going to see pass them as an argument in other function. So we should be able to pass this function as an argument to the other function. All right, and how can we do that? Let's see that as well. So here I will say okay, create one more function, and this time I will say operate. And what does this operate will do actually? This will, okay, let's first define this. So I'll say operate, and you are seeing here I am just following Pascal casing over here. That means every word I am starting with capital. Why is that so? That is because Golang is case sensitive, and if you are defining a function that is with a small casing, that means that function will only be visible on the specific package, right? And this time the package is main. That means only main should be able to access this function. If we are going to define other package, that package won't be able to use this function, because then this function will be private to the specific package, right? But if we'll make it capitalize Pascal casing, then this function will be available throughout the package. So I will just say operate, and then I'm going to say okay, just take a value a of type integer, and then b is going to be of type integer as well, and then this time I'm going to say op. Op is nothing but operation. All right. So what this operation will actually do, this is expecting a function to be passed here. So I will say okay, pass a function, and that function should contain two value once more. So I'll say integer. This time we don't need to provide the variable name, because we are going to pass a function as a parameter. So if you're passing a function as a parameter, you don't need to define variable name over there. You can just say you give me the data of this type. All right, and then this function can return an integer value, and then finally like this. Let me just do this, and integer, right? So we don't need this here, and I will say okay this. But then here also we need something after this integer, right? Yeah, so now this is correct, and you can see here this actually input is expecting a function, and then it will return integer, and this is of course the closure of this specific function operate. So this spelling is wrong actually, so it should be operate. Let's correct this, and then what I will do here is I will pass the parameter over here when we are going to call this operate function, and then what I'll do is I'll just say return, and I will call this function, let's say a and b. Will this work? This should actually work. And what is the error? We are getting too many return values. So what it's expecting actually? Okay, we are giving here integer. Okay, we need to return some integer value, right? So we can say, okay, this will return an integer value. So now if we are taking this function over here, we can say, okay, that's completely fine. And then I will pass a and b over here, right? So this example is actually a bit confusing. So let's take one more example. But we know that how can we write a function that actually expect a function. So let me just write one more function, and this time I'm going to say, let's say this function will perform certain functionality. And what is that functionality? Let's say this function will fetch data from somewhere, right? It will get data from somewhere, and from where it is going to get data, of course that depends on you. So I will say, okay, fetch data or something, fetch data, right? And then I will say, okay, this time I'll say a of type, not a, let's take a real example, and then we will know how we can relate it with the real scenario, right? So that you will be able to understand it more clear way, right? So let me do that. So what I'm going to do here is, in this case, forget about this fetch data. Let's say create one function with name apply operation, and this time what we will be trying to do is, we'll be accepting two inputs, and then based on the function which we will be passing, it will perform the operation on that function on that data a and b. So let's say I'll say apply operation, and then this time we need two variable, and then we need one function as well over there. So I'll say operation, and then this operation we are expecting of type integer, and then this will return one more integer over there, and finally this function will return the integer, right? And then here what we can say as, okay, this is completely fine, and if the function which you are going to provide me, I will just call those function here, and then you will be getting the result, right? So instead of returning, I will just say result, and then if just assume this is going to be a function. We know that we can pass function to a different function. So this is one of the function, and then we are expecting one more function as an argument over here in this function. So we can do that, right? Then I will just call this function which you are going to pass here, and that is the same concept over here. If your function is treated as a variable, of course the variable can be passed to a different function, right? And you can call that function there itself, right, instead of calling right away. So the same thing here we are going to do is, I will say operation, which is of course coming as a parameter, and then I will call this operation. I will pass this a and b over here. Then this, we can see here, this operation is a function which will accept two value as an integer, and then it will return the integer value, right? So now this function completely depends on the function which we will pass over here. So this is the way we can pass a function, and then we can perform the operation, and this is also called a callback function. So here what I'm going to say is, okay, if that is the case, we'll be getting result as well, because we know that this operation is actually going to return integer value. So now overall this apply function, if you see here, is returning integer. So I can say now return this result, right? Completely fine. It's very easy. We just wrote a function. Let me just remove this. We just wrote a function, write a function, and that which is expecting three data. One is a, b, and then the operation itself, right? So I'll just save this. And how can we call this function then? So let's try to call this function. So what I will do here is, I will copy this function name and try to call above in the main function. Let me just comment this here, and then I will say, okay, that's completely fine. Call this function, right? But then this function is of course expecting three parameters, three arguments over there. One is a, b, and then the function, right? So I will say, okay, provide 2 and 6, any data you want, and then third is going to be a function. So how can we pass a function over here? It's expecting a function. For that we need to define a function, right? How can we define a function? Let's say, and that function is going to be an operation. It can do anything, and based on this two data, correct? So let's say I'm going to define an add function. This operation is going to be add, and then we know that we can assign a function to a variable. Same thing we are doing here. So I will say, okay, create one function, or we can say, okay, just create this function over here. I will say func, and the name of the function I'm going to say add, and then it will have two parameter, a and b. In short form we can say a comma b, and then both is going to be of type integer. All right. So what's the issue here? Okay, expected this, found this. Let me just take it out from here and I will paste it here if that is fine. Yeah, that's completely fine. Now if we'll add this, it will return some values, right? So here I will say return a plus b, because this function operation is specifically add, right? So I'll say a plus b, right? So now okay, this function will be returning some values, so we need to say integer, right? Since this function as a parameter here is expecting a function which should have two parameter and then one returning type, and the same we did here, right? Now it is completely legal to pass this function over here. So let's make it capitalize, and I will pass this function here. And how can I pass? So I'll just say add, right? So let me just save this and I will just hover on this. Now we can see here overall this function is going to return an integer, right? So I will say, okay, we can store a result over here as well, and then let me just print the result. So I'll say fmt.println and result. Let's just save this and run it if that works. Here I'm going to clear the console now and run it. So we can see we are getting 8, and that is actually correct because 6 plus 2 is going to be 8. And this time we make this functionality depend on what? This function which we are passing over here. And this time we are saying, okay, just apply operation, but operation is going to be add. Now this function is more flexible and more reusable. So I can say, okay, next time I want this apply operation to multiply this value. So we can say, okay, func, and then I will just create multiply function. I believe that is already present there down below. You can see here. So I'll just use this multiply over here. So this time I'm going to say, okay, again this function will be returning some result, right? So I'll say result and then apply operation, call this function once more. Here I'm going to say, let's say 3 and 7, and then it's expecting one more function, right, as a third parameter argument, and then the function signature should be integer as an input, and then integer will be a returning type. So we know that multiply definition or declaration, multiply method signature is same as this expected functionality functions, right? So we can pass multiply here. So I'll just say multiply, and then I will just try to log this result. So I'll say, okay, response. Let me just save this and run this if that works. We can see here we are getting 21, and this 8 is of course of this specific operation, but in this case we don't have to change this apply operation functionality, right? It is there as it is. We'll just pass a dynamic function over there and it is working in the expected way. That's the cool feature, right? That's how we are achieving the flexibility, correct? So if you want to perform divide as well, you can perform divide as well, but let's see that if we can do this. So I'll say divide result dr, and then I'll say apply operation, and this time I'm going to say, let's say 15 2, and what if I'm going to assign divide, not call, right? So we are seeing error over here. Why? Because this divide is having different method signature what this apply operation is expecting. This apply operation is expecting a function which will take two input of type integer and then integer, and then it will be returning an integer value. but then this divide is of type, of course this is taking two input A and B, but then in this case it is returning two input, that is it is returning two values over there, right? So this is not legal in Golang. We need to provide the same method signature over there. So this is how we can make our code much more modular and much more flexible. You saw that we don't have to write or call the different function over here. We just created that function somewhere and passed that as a argument in different function. This apply function is a function, and then this multiply add is also a function, and we are able to pass this function as an argument to this apply operation function. I hope it is clear now, right? So if you guys are still facing any problem, if you guys have doubt, let me know in the comment section. I will try to address all those doubt as early as possible. So now we are done with the second first class function topics, right? And then we also know that we can return a function from a function. And how can we do that, right? So this is nothing but just going to be a concept of closure. And what does closure means, right? So closure is nothing. Let me just define closure. So closure is nothing but it is a function that remembers the variable in its surrounding scope. What does that mean? That means, let's say if this is a function, this will remember the variable which is getting defined here. So let's say I'm going to define a variable over here. I'll say variable equals to 10. Then this function will actually remember this variable. This function will have access to its surrounding variable which is outside of this function. Alright, this is just an example. So let me just give a real example and then you will be able to understand it more clear. So I'm going to create one more function by the concept of returning them from other function. So I'll create a counter. Let's say counter, it will just count for the value, and then this counter will actually return a function, right? We saw in the first case we are able to assign this function to a variable, and then in the second case we saw this function we can pass as an argument to the different function, right? And now this time we are going to see how can we return a function from a different function. So this time I'm going to say, okay, this will return a function, right? So you need to define a type over there. Okay, this time from this counter, this function is going to be returned, and then this function which we are going to return from this counter, it should return actually the function integer value. And then let's say here I'm going to create one variable count, and by default I'm going to initialize as 0. And then since this counter is going to return the function again which is going to return an integer value, so we can say okay, return, and then I will say here as a func. You can see here it is giving you a suggestion. So now we can see, okay, this function counter function is actually expecting a return value as this, and then of course we are returning the same thing over here. So that is completely legal in Golang. And then here what we can do is we can say, okay, whenever we call this counter, right, so this count variable will get increased by 1, and then we are returning the count variable. So let's see that. I will just increment this count variable by 1, and then finally I will just return this count over here, right? So now let's call this counter and see if that is working fine. So what I'll do here is I'll just comment this line above, and then I will call that increment function. So I'll say, let's say increment, and then I will just assign a counter function, not assign, but we'll just call this counter function over there. So I call this counter function, and then if since this is a counter function, right, it will again return a function. So if this counter function will again return a function, that means this increment is going to be a function, correct? And what type of function this will be? Of course the function which we are returning from the counter, right? So here I'm going to say, okay, if this increment is again a function, then let's just call this function. So I'll say println and then I will call this increment. It's a function, right? So if it is a function, we should be able to call this. Correct? This is completely legal and it's as simple as that. So I will just call this and let's save this, run it and see if that works. We can see 1 over there, right? Because we have defined the counter variable as 0 by default, and then whenever this function will get called, right, this function will actually return a function, and when we call that function, then of course it is going to increment the count by 1 and it will just return this count. That's what's happening over there. And to understand it more properly, you can see here, of course this increment will be a type, a type of function. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call, since by the concept of this specific return them from other function, we know that already I said if this is returning function, right, return type is going to be a function, then this function will have access, or this function will remember the variable or constant around this function. That means the variable which is above this function or inside this function will be having access of all those variables. So if we have access, we should be able to modify the variable as well. So that's what we are doing here inside this function. And then what if I'll keep calling this function and let's see if exactly that function is able to remember those variables. So I'll say fmt.println and I will just call this increment function once more. Let me just save this and run this code once again and see what is the exact output over there. You can see this time we are getting 2. Previous time when we call this, we are getting 1. That means this function which is getting returned from here, right? This function is actually remembering the value of this count. So this counter is actually responsible for that. That means this counter is remembering this value, and then this value is again used by this function to modify or to return it back whenever we call this counter. Right? As simple as that. And then as many as times we'll call this specific variable will keep incrementing. Why? Because we created a counter over there. That means we know that in memory we have counter over there, but then from this counter we are getting one more function, right? So now this counter will return a function. Of course we are performing certain modification using this function, and then whatever data will be there on this counter will get modified or will not modify. That's completely depend on this function. That's what we write there, right? So let me just save this and run this, and we can see that it is working. It's getting incremented, right? So that's the cool feature of closure in Golang, right? So now we are going to see one more thing over here, and this time we are going to use a keyword. And what exactly is that? So let me just define one more function over here, and I will say, let's say execute last. This is going to be a name of function. Anything you want you can put there as a name, and then I will just do one more thing over here. So I will say fmt.println, right? And then I will say, let's say this will run at last, right? And then I will put couple of more print statements so that we can be able to understand what is exactly happening over there. So I will say, okay, this will run at beginning, let's say beginning, right? And then, or we can say this will run, and 1 I can say this will run 2, right? You can put whatever value you want to put, but this is just for understanding. All right, so let me just save this, and what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to put a defer keyword over here, And what is the differ? This is completely new keyword, right? We don't know about differ. So what the hell this differ is in Golang? So differ is nothing. Whenever we execute any line, or whenever that line will get executed, and if there's a differ in front of that, that means there will be delay in that execution. That means that line won't be getting executed at all. Even though you are writing that line on the top, that line will not be executed. This will always be executed at the bottom of the, it will just, what Golang will do, Golang will just place this line at the bottom of this code. So it will just, replaced here. And every time you write differs, all those get replaced over here in the bottom. And this all code which is already present there, it will run at the top. That's the concept of differ. Basically you are saying, okay, you are going to delay the execution of this line until this function executed properly, or the execution, all the execution of the rest of the line is completed, then only execute this differ, right? So let me just remove, not remove, but replace on the top and save it. I will just call this function and let's see what you are getting the output. So clear this console, I will call it here. This time I'm going to remove this all, and then I'm just going to comment this so that I can be able to call this and see the proper console on the proper console basically. And let's run this function. You can see here this will run 1, this will run 2, and then at last this will run at last. That means this differ works in the expected way. So why differ is there, right? So that is nothing but just to, this will help a developer. Let's say you are writing a file, or you are playing with the file data or something that has to be executed later in the program. So as a developer we tend to generate error, right? Since we are a human, we can generate error, a lot of errors. And then what if, let's say we are writing a function and that function has 100 of lines. We may forget to execute a certain functionality. Let's say we are writing content into a file, and if we won't close that file, that means the file will be open always in the Golang program. We must need to close that file, right? Otherwise it will be occupying a lot of memory, right? So for that, whenever we play with the file, at very beginning we are going to say, okay, differ close. That means this line is going to be executed at last for sure whenever this functionality is completed, whenever rest of the code is executed properly in this specific function, then that has to be closed, right? So that is the exact concept of differ. You are just going to delay the execution to the last, right? So now we know that differ, what is differ there, all right? Now there's one more concept inside the function, that is panic and recover. And what is that exactly? So panic is nothing when you are writing a function and something goes terribly wrong, right? That is called panic. And then recover is of course used to handle the panic gracefully. So that means your program won't break, and you will be able to recover from the specific error. So let's see that in action, how we can do that. So this time I'm going to say, okay, function, and then I will say safe, not safe, I'm just going to say, okay, safe divide. I'll say safe divide. And what is the meaning of safe divide? So any number which we are going to divide it by 0, we will be getting infinity, right? So I'll say a, b, two variable we are going to take as an input, and then we'll say differ, right? And we will say func, right? So after executing all the line of code, this differ function will get executed, and this is actually called the anonymous function as well. Just remove this differ, and you can see here this is called the anonymous function because we don't have name here in this function. And how can we call this function? Since this is of course a function, but then we need to call like this. And this is also called anonymous function, or you can say immediately invoked function. All right. So now you learned one more concept over here. We have anonymous function as well, the function which does not have any name, and we can call that immediately as well. And if we are calling that immediately, of course, that is a immediately invoked function. So here what I'm going to do is, okay, I will say if, and I will say or, and then I'll say recover. So recover is a function in Golang, okay, and we can use that recover. Actually this recover will give an object, and if it is not going to be nil, we know that there's something error, some error happened, right? So I will just say fmt.println, and I will say recovered from, and then I will say or, and or is nothing, is an interface. So it will be any type of data, which if you guys are not aware of what is interface, you can go there, go back in this playlist, and you can search for interface. So that is completely fine. And here of course this function will get executed, but then I'm going to put differ. So if there's any error, always this function will get executed and we will be getting the error. And this time I'm going to say, let's say if b equals to, that means denominator is going to be 0. So I'm going to say, okay, panic. That means something terribly wrong happens. We cannot divide a number with the 0, it will be infinity. So I'll say panic, okay, and then I'll say cannot divide, right, by 0. Cool. And then if we are done with this, I will just say println. If we don't have any panic, that means this won't be true actually, and then we'll be getting the result. So I'll just print this result instead of returning it from here. So I'll just say result, and then result is going to be of course a divided by b. Cool. Let me just save this, and we are going to call this function over here, and we'll see if that works. So let's go up and call this function over here in the main function so that we can see if that works. I will just comment this here and call this function here. This time this function is not going to return anything, so we don't need to worry about creating variable and doing console and all. So we are doing console inside this variable itself. We just need to pass the value here. So I will say 10 divided by 0, or any number divided by 0. So let me just save this and call this function, and we'll see what happens over there. You can see here recovered from cannot divide by 0, right? And why is that so? Because when we are going to say panic, that means there's something terribly wrong happened over there, right? And you are saying this to Golang, then Golang will do what? Golang will put this into a recover object, right? This will return error or something which you are returning from here, which you are providing here in the panic. This panic you can see here, this is a function in Golang, and then it is expecting any value over there. You can return error also from here if you want. And then this or here you can see this recover will actually getting those errors. So basically in simple words you are going to say, okay, whatever we will pass here in the panic, that will be accepted by this recover, means that will be returned by this recover, and then of course we will be getting those in a variable, and then we can check for the variable. If it is not nil, that means something happens, right? And then if something happens, we are just going to print, okay, something happens, or we can say recovered from this error. So this is how we can use, this is what the concept of first class functions. We know, we learned a lot of concept. How can we define a function? Why we are defining a function? How function is, getting returned from another function? How it is getting passed into another function? What is defer? What is multiple return type function? What is the anonymous function? What is immediately invoked function? What is panic and what is recover? We all learned that concept, right? So now you should be able to write any function which you want, and you should be able to write it very smoothly, right? And if you guys have any issue, please let me know in the comment section. I will try to resolve all those issues as early as possible. And do subscribe my YouTube channel and keep like button if you like this video, and do share as well. So thank you guys. I will meet you in the next videos.